Mama, please don't die. Please don't leave us. 12-year-old Kofi whispered, his small hands clutching his mother's burning fingers as she lay gasping on the thin mattress that reeked of sweat and sickness. Beside him, his twin brother Kwame pressed a wet rag to their mother's forehead, the cloth already warm from her fever. The empty medicine bottles on the wooden crate mocked them. 5 days without treatment, and their mother's rattling breath grew weaker with each passing hour. Hello, gorgeous family. Welcome to Luxurious Obsession Stories. If you're ready for the most devastating tale of love, desperation, and family secrets that will absolutely destroy you emotionally, smash that subscribe button right now. This story will grab your heart and never let go. Drop a heart if you're ready to ugly cry with us. The cock hadn't even crowed when Kofi's eyes snapped open to the sound that haunted his nightmares. His mother's violent coughing. Each cough tore through the silence like broken glass, followed by a wet, gurgling sound that made his stomach twist with terror. Cough, gasp, silence, cough, gasp, silence. Kwame was already awake on his sleeping mat, staring at the rusted zinc ceiling with wide, frightened eyes. They had learned to count the seconds between their mother's coughs. When the silence stretched too long, they held their breath, waiting to see if she would breathe again. "Mama," Kofi whispered into the darkness of their one-room shack. No answer, just the sound of labored breathing from the corner where their mother lay on a mattress so thin they could feel every wooden plank beneath it. Kofi crawled across the cold concrete floor to where Akosua lay curled under a faded wrapper that had once been bright yellow. Now it was the color of old bones. His mother's face was slick with sweat, her lips cracked and pale, her cheeks hollow from the weight she'd lost. At 32, she looked like an old woman dying alone. "Mama," Kwame whispered, joining his brother beside the mattress. "Are you awake?" Their mother's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and glassy with fever. It took her several seconds to recognize her son's faces in the dim light filtering through the cardboard they'd taped over the broken window. "My boys," she breathed, her voice like sandpaper on wood. "What time is it?" "Early, Mama," Kofi said, his throat tight with unshed tears. "Before sunrise." Akosua tried to sit up but collapsed back against the flat pillow that smelled of medicine and desperation. Her breathing came in short, shallow pants, like she'd been running for hours. "The pain," she whispered, pressing her hand to her chest. "It's getting worse." Kwame reached for the plastic bottle of cough syrup on the wooden crate beside the mattress. Empty. He shook it anyway, hoping for a miracle, but heard only hollow plastic. "It's finished, Mama," he said, his voice cracking. Their mother closed her eyes, and a single tear rolled down her temple into her hair. "How much do we have?" she asked without opening her eyes. The twins exchanged a look. They had counted their savings every night for the past week, hoping somehow the coins would multiply while they slept. 12 cedis, Kofi said quietly. "The medicine costs 200, Kwame added. The silence that followed was heavier than the humid morning air that pressed against their skin like a wet blanket. "We'll find a way, Mama," Kofi said with false confidence. "We always do." But they all knew this was different. This wasn't about food or school fees or clothes. This was about life and death, and they were running out of time. Outside their shack, Jamestown was waking up. They could hear Mrs. Comfort next door scolding her children to get ready for school, the distant sound of lorries honking on the main road, and the call of the bread seller making his morning rounds. Normal sounds, life-continuing sounds. Sounds that reminded them that while their world was falling apart, everyone else's world kept spinning. "I'm hungry," Kwame whispered, though he immediately looked guilty for saying it. Their mother's eyes opened again, filled with the kind of pain that had nothing to do with her illness. "There's bread," she said, "in the cupboard. Share it." Kofi knew there was no bread. There hadn't been bread for 2 days. But he stood up and walked to the small wooden cupboard anyway, making noise as he pretended to search. "Can't find it, Mama," he called out softly. "We'll get some later." "We already ate," Kwame added quickly. "This morning before you woke up." Their mother nodded, too weak to question their lies. The twins had perfected the art of lying about food. They took turns eating on the days when there was only enough for one. They told their mother they'd eaten at school when there was no lunch money. They pretended to be full when their stomachs cramped with hunger. Anything to keep her from worrying. Anything to let her use what little strength she had to fight the sickness eating her alive from the inside. By midday, the heat had turned their shack into an oven. The zinc roof radiated waves of heat that made the air shimmer, and their mother's fever climbed higher. Kofi sat on the concrete floor, counting their money for the 100th time. 12 setis and 30 pesewas. The coins were warm in his palm, some of them sticky from handling. "Maybe we can borrow," Kwame suggested, though they both knew they'd already tried everyone. "From who?" Kofi asked. "Auntie Amma said she doesn't have money for her own children's medicine. Uncle Kojo won't even look at us anymore since we couldn't pay back the 5 setis." They had spent weeks begging, door to door through Jamestown, explaining about their mother's sickness, promising to pay back with interest. Some people gave them a few pesewas out of pity. Most just shook their heads and closed their doors. "The church?" Kwame tried. "Pastor said they'll pray for us," Kofi replied bitterly. "But prayers don't buy medicine." Their mother stirred on the mattress, mumbling something in her sleep. Both boys rushed to her side. "Water," she whispered without opening her eyes. Kwame held a cup to her lips while Kofi supported her head. She managed 3 small sips before falling back, exhausted by the effort. "We need to do something," Kofi said as they watched their mother's chest rise and fall in irregular rhythms. "Like what?" "I don't know. Something." They sat in silence, listening to the sounds of life outside their door. Children playing, women arguing over prices at the market, men discussing football results. Normal life. Life that continued while theirs stood still. "Rich people," Kwame said suddenly. "What about them?" "They have money. More money than they know what to do with." Kofi looked at his brother. "So? So maybe some of them wouldn't miss a little bit?" The words hung in the air between them like smoke. Neither boy wanted to be the first to say what they were both thinking. "That's stealing," Kofi said finally. "I know. Mama taught us never to steal. I know. It's wrong. I know." They looked at their mother, whose breathing had become so shallow, they had to watch carefully to see her chest move. "But she's dying," Kwame whispered, "and we can't save her with 12 CDs. And rich people have hundreds of CDs. In their wallets, just sitting there." The idea was terrible and desperate and impossible. It was also the only idea they had. That afternoon, they spent their last 2 CDs on Trotro Fare to downtown Accra. The city hit them like a wall of noise and chaos. Car horns blaring, vendors shouting, music blasting from shops, and thousands of people moving in every direction. But it was the wealth that stunned them into silence. Cars that gleamed like jewels. Buildings made of glass that reflected the sky. People wearing clothes that looked like they'd never been worn before. Women with handbags that probably cost more than their mother's medicine. Men with watches that caught the sunlight like trapped stars. "Look," Kwame breathed, pointing at a man stepping out of a Range Rover. The man was tall and confident, wearing a suit that fit him like it had been painted on. He walked like he owned the street, the building, maybe the whole city. On his wrist was a gold watch, and in his hand was a phone that looked like it belonged in a science fiction movie. "He has money," Kofi observed. "Lots of money. More than he needs. More than he could spend." They followed the man for half a block, staying far behind, learning how rich people moved through the world. They noticed everything: how they held themselves, where they kept their phones, which pockets bulged with wallets. "That one," Kwame said, nodding toward a woman in designer heels clicking across the pavement. "Too many people around her," Kofi replied. "Him?" Kwame pointed to an older man reading a newspaper outside a bank. "Security cameras." They were learning. They were also terrifying themselves with how quickly they were learning. For 2 hours, they watched and waited and planned. They saw dozens of potential targets, each one carrying more money than their family had ever possessed. But each time, something stopped them. Too many witnesses, too much security, too much fear. "Maybe we should go home," Kwame said as the afternoon wore on. "With what? Empty hands and a dying mother?" "It's wrong, Kofi. I know it's wrong. But what choice do we have?" Before Kwame could answer, they saw him. David Asante walked out of the gleaming office building like he owned the world. Everything about him screamed wealth. The perfectly tailored navy suit, the Italian leather shoes, the confidence that came from never having worried about money in his entire life. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with graying temples and the kind of presence that made people step aside when he walked past. In one hand, he carried a briefcase that probably cost more than most people made in a month. In the other, he held a phone pressed to his ear. "Yes, confirm the transfer," he was saying as he walked toward a black SUV parked at the curb. "All of it, today." The twins watched from across the street as David ended his call and slipped his phone into his jacket pocket. As he did, they saw it: a thick leather wallet in the back pocket of his trousers, carelessly placed and easily accessible. "He's perfect," Kofi whispered. "He's alone," Kwame agreed. "No security. Distracted. Rich. Very rich." They studied David as he opened the door of his SUV. He moved with the casual arrogance of someone who had never been hungry, never been desperate, never had to choose between medicine and food. "He probably spends more on lunch than we need for Mama's medicine," Kofi said bitterly. "Look at his watch," Kwame added. "That could pay for a whole hospital." David was everything they weren't: wealthy, powerful, protected. He lived in a world where money solved problems instead of creating them, where sickness meant inconvenience rather than death sentences. "It's not fair," Kofi said. "Life isn't fair," Kwame replied. "But maybe we can make it a little more fair." They watched as David closed his car door and walked back toward the building, his phone ringing again. He answered it without looking around, completely unaware of the two desperate boys watching his every move. "Now or never," Kofi said. "Together? Together." They crossed the street with their hearts hammering against their ribs. Every step felt like walking toward a cliff, but they kept moving because behind them was something worse than falling: their mother dying while they did nothing. David Asante stood at the intersection of Liberation Road and Kojo Thompson Street, his phone pressed to his ear as he discussed quarterly projections with his CFO. The late afternoon sun reflected off the glass towers around him, and the city hummed with the energy of money being made and spent. He was completely unaware of the two 12-year-old boys who had been following him for the past hour. "The Singapore deal?" he said into his phone. "Push it through. I don't care what it costs." Kofi and Kwame exchanged a look from 20 feet away. "I don't care what it costs." Those words hit them like physical blows. Here was a man who spent money without thinking while their mother lay dying for lack of it. "You ready?" Kofi whispered. Kwame's hands were shaking. "What if we get caught? What if Mama dies while we do nothing?" The traffic light changed and David stepped into the crosswalk, still absorbed in his phone conversation. This was their moment. Kofi moved first, running directly at David as if he wasn't looking. "Sir! Sir!" Kofi called out, bumping hard into David's side. "Sorry! Sorry!" "Please, sir, can you tell me how to get to Circle?" David stumbled slightly, instinctively steadying himself while trying to continue his phone call. "Watch where you're going, boy," he said irritably. "Please, sir," Kofi continued, grabbing David's arm and spinning him around. "My grandmother is sick and I need to find Circle. Please, which way?" In the confusion, Kwame struck like lightning. His small fingers slipped into David's back pocket and closed around the thick leather wallet. One smooth motion, and it was gone. "That way," David said, pointing down the street while trying to shake off the persistent boy. "Now move along." "Thank you, sir. Thank you," Kofi called out, already backing away. It took David 3 more seconds to realize something was wrong. His hand went automatically to his back pocket, and his face changed completely when he found it empty. "Hey!" he shouted, his phone call forgotten. "Hey! You boys!" But the twins were already running. They sprinted through the crowded streets like their lives depended on it, which, in a way, they did. Behind them, David's voice boomed over the traffic noise. "Stop those boys! Thieves! Someone stop them!" People turned to stare, but the twins were small and fast and desperate. They ducked between cars, leaped over gutters, and disappeared into the maze of side streets that only locals knew how to navigate. They didn't stop running until they reached an abandoned construction site 3 miles away. Only then did they collapse against a concrete wall, their chests heaving and their hearts beating so fast they thought they might die. "We did it," Kwame gasped. "We actually did it," Kofi panted. For several minutes, they just sat there, trying to catch their breath and process what they had done. They had crossed a line they could never uncross. They were thieves now. But they were also their mother's last hope. With trembling hands, Kofi opened the leather wallet. It was heavier than he'd expected, made of soft brown leather that probably cost more than their family spent on food in a month. Inside was more money than they had ever seen in their lives. Cetus, dollars, euros, thick stacks of bills held together with gold clips, credit cards with names embossed in silver, business cards for companies they'd never heard of, and identification that told them their victim's name, David Asante. "How much?" Kwame whispered. Kofi counted quickly. More than 5,000 cetus. Maybe 10,000. "We only need 200. "I know. We take what we need and return the rest." "How?" "We don't know where he lives." They stared at the money, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they'd stolen. This wasn't just medicine money. This was life-changing money. "We're not greedy," Kofi said firmly. "We take what Mama needs. Nothing more." "We're not real thieves," Kwame agreed. "We're just desperate." Kofi began separating the money they needed from the rest when something slipped from between the bills and fluttered to the ground. A photograph. Kwame picked it up, and the world stopped spinning. The woman in the picture was young, maybe 20, with bright eyes and a radiant smile. She was wearing a simple yellow dress and standing in front of a church, looking like she'd just heard the best news of her life. She looked exactly like their mother. "Kofi." Kwame's voice was barely a whisper. "Look." Kofi looked, and his hands began to shake so violently he nearly dropped the wallet. That's Mama," he breathed, "but younger. Much younger. Before she got sick. Before we were born." They stared at the photograph in stunned silence. Their mother's face smiled up at them from 13 years in the past, frozen in a moment of pure happiness they had never seen in real life. Slowly, Kofi turned the photograph over. Written on the back in faded blue ink, in handwriting they didn't recognize, were the words, "My beautiful Akosua. Forever yours, David." The twins looked at each other with wide, terrified eyes. "David," Kofi whispered. "David Asante," Kwame said, looking at the identification in the wallet. "The man we just robbed. Our father." The photograph slipped from Kwame's nerveless fingers and drifted back to the ground, where it lay between them like evidence of a crime they hadn't known they were committing. They had stolen from their own father, the father who had abandoned them, the father who had more money than he could spend while his sons begged for coins to save their mother's life. "He left us," Kofi said, his voice hollow. "He left Mama to die. He left us to starve. While he lived like a king, the shock was giving way to something else now, something hot and bitter and poisonous. Rage. "He has all this money," Kwame said, his voice shaking with emotion. "All this money, and he never sent us even one CD. He let Mama get sick. He let us go hungry. He didn't care if we lived or died." Kofi picked up the photograph and stared at his mother's young, happy face. When was the last time he'd seen her smile like that? When was the last time she'd looked anything but tired and worried and sick? "We're keeping it," he said suddenly. "What?" "All of it. Every CD. He owes us 13 years of child support." "Kofi." "No." Kofi's voice was hard now, harder than any 12-year-old's voice should be. He made his choice 13 years ago. He chose his comfortable life over his family. Well, now we're choosing our mother over his comfort. Kwame stared at his twin brother, seeing something in Kofi's eyes that hadn't been there an hour ago. Something cold and determined and frightening. "We take what we need for Mama's medicine," Kwame said carefully. "That's what we came for." "We take what he owes us," Kofi replied. "And he owes us everything." The photograph lay between them, their mother's smile a reminder of happiness stolen and love abandoned. In the distance, they could hear the sounds of the city continuing its daily business, unaware that two children had just discovered the worst kind of betrayal. Their father was alive and wealthy and had never cared enough to find them. But now, they had found him. The journey back to Jamestown felt like traveling between two different worlds. In their pockets, they carried more money than their family had ever possessed, but their hearts were heavy with the weight of discovery. David Asante, their father. The man who had smiled at their mother in the photograph, who had written "Forever Yours" on the back, who had somehow disappeared from their lives completely. "What do we tell Mama?" Kwame asked as they rode in the back of a shared taxi. "About the money or about him?" "Both." Kofi stared out the window at the city flowing past, the wealth giving way to poverty as they moved from the gleaming downtown to the crowded, dusty neighborhoods where real people lived real lives. "We tell her we found a way to get the medicine," he said finally. "We don't tell her how. And about our father? We ask her to tell us the truth, all of it." The taxi dropped them at the edge of Jamestown as the sun was beginning to set. They walked through the familiar maze of narrow alleys and corrugated iron shacks, past neighbors they'd known their whole lives, past the corner where they'd played as children before their mother got sick and childhood became a luxury they couldn't afford. Nothing had changed in the few hours they'd been gone, but everything felt different. They were different. The boys who had left that morning to beg for medicine had returned as thieves, carrying more money than their neighbors would see in a year. "Kofi, Kwame," Mrs. Comfort called from her doorway. "How is your mother today?" "Better," Kofi lied smoothly. "Much better." "Praise God," Mrs. Comfort replied. "I've been praying for her." Prayers. Everyone had prayers for their mother. No one had money, but everyone had prayers. Their shack looked smaller when they returned, shabbier and more desperate. The contrast with the gleaming city they just left was jarring. Two worlds, separated by a few miles and an ocean of opportunity. Their mother was awake when they entered, propped up against the wall with her eyes closed. She looked like she'd grown thinner in the few hours they'd been gone, her cheeks more hollow, her breathing more labored. "Mama?" Kwame said softly. Her eyes opened, taking several seconds to focus on their faces. "My boys," she whispered, "where have you been?" "Getting medicine," Kofi said, pulling out enough bills to cover the prescription. "We found a way." Their mother stared at the money in confusion. "How much is this?" "Enough," Kwame said quickly. "More than enough." "But where did you get it? We don't have this kind of money." The twins exchanged a look. They had practiced this conversation on the way home, but now that the moment was here, the lies felt heavy on their tongues. "Someone helped us," Kofi said. "A kind person who heard about your sickness." "What kind person?" "Someone from the city. They said they wanted to help." Their mother's eyes narrowed slightly. Even sick and weak, she knew her sons well enough to recognize when they weren't telling the whole truth. "Show me," she said. Kwame handed her the money, and she examined it carefully. The bills were crisp and new, the kind that came from banks rather than street trading. "This is a lot of money," she said slowly. "More than you need for medicine." "The person said we should buy food too," Kofi added quickly, "and maybe some things for the house." Their mother was quiet for a long moment, studying their faces. "You're lying to me," she said finally. "Both of you. I can see it in your eyes." The boys looked at the floor, unable to meet her gaze. "We got the money," Kwame said quietly. "That's what matters. How you got it matters too." "Why?" Kofi's voice was sharper than he intended. "Why does it matter how we got it if it saves your life?" "Because how we do things matters as much as what we do. Even if you die?" "Especially if I die." Kofi felt the anger rising in his chest again, the same anger that had consumed him when he discovered the photograph. Anger at the unfairness of it all, at the way the world was divided between people who had everything and people who had nothing. "Mama," he said, his voice tight with emotion. "What do you know about David Asante?" The change in their mother's face was immediate and dramatic. All the color drained from her cheeks, and her hand went instinctively to the thin gold chain around her neck. "Where did you hear that name?" she whispered. "Answer the question," Kofi said, his voice harder than it had ever been. "Kofi," Kwame warned, but his brother continued. "Is David Asante our father?" Their mother closed her eyes and was silent for so long that they thought she might have fallen asleep. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "Yes." "And where is he now?" "I don't know." "You're lying." "Kofi," Kwame said sharply. "She's lying, and I'm tired of lies. Where is David Asante, Mama?" Their mother opened her eyes, and they were filled with tears. "He lives in Accra," she said quietly. "He's a successful businessman. He has a company, houses, cars, everything money can buy." "And he knows about us?" Their mother was quiet again. "Does he know about us?" Kofi repeated, his voice rising. "No," she whispered. "He doesn't know." "Why not?" "Because I never told him." The silence that followed was deafening. Outside, they could hear the normal sounds of evening in Jamestown. Children playing, women cooking, men discussing the day's events. Inside their shack, the weight of 13 years of secrets pressed down on them like a physical force. "Why?" Kwame asked finally, his voice small and confused. Their mother struggled to sit up straighter, wincing with the effort. "Because he had a different life," she said. "A wife, responsibilities. I couldn't destroy that." "What about us?" Kofi demanded. "What about your responsibilities to us?" "I chose to protect you." "From what? From having a father who could take care of us? From having a father who might reject you?" The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire they couldn't put out. "So you let us grow up poor instead," Kofi said bitterly. "You let us struggle and starve and watch you die because you were afraid he might not want us." "I thought I was doing the right thing." "The right thing would have been giving us a choice." Their mother began to cry then, silent tears that rolled down her thin cheeks and disappeared into her hair. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry. I thought I could take care of you myself. I thought I was strong enough." Kwame moved to comfort her, but Kofi remained standing, his fists clenched at his sides. "Well, you weren't," he said, "and now we had to find our own way to save you." "What does that mean?" Kofi pulled the photograph from his pocket and held it in front of his mother's face. "It means we found David Asante ourselves." To be continued. The revelation is about to get even more devastating in part 2. What happens when David discovers who really stole his wallet? How will he react when he learns he has 2 sons who needed him all along? Will this broken family find a way to heal? Or will the pain of 13 years of separation be too much to overcome? Smash that subscribe button and hit the notification bell because part 2 drops tomorrow and you will not want to miss it. This story is about to take a turn that will leave you absolutely speechless. Comment below, Team Kofi or Team Mama? Who do you think is right in this devastating family drama?